Imagine waking up to discover your husband was tortured and executed by drug traffickers, and that neither the police nor the FBI want to get involved. The killers walk free on the same streets where you live. What would you do? Margaret Thompson had an answer nobody expected. She knew the Everglades better than any living person, knew every channel, every river arm, every bend of that labyrinth of water and mud. But most importantly, she knew the alligators, animals 16 feet long, 900 pounds, jaws that crush human bones like dry twigs. For 2 years, Margaret transformed her knowledge into something no court would dare do. She hunted 14 men, one by one, using America's most ancient predators as her executioners, left no evidence, left no witnesses. This is the true story of how a 110-pound woman faced down an entire criminal organization and won, how she transformed the Everglades into a courtroom where the only sentence was death. Margaret Ann Thompson was born in 1965 on a small ranch along the Shark River, in the heart of the Florida Everglades. Daughter of a fisherman and a midwife, third of 6 siblings, she grew up literally in the water, learned to swim before she could walk, pilot airboats before she could write. But what really fascinated her were the alligators, thousands of them in the waters around her. Hatchlings 12 inches long, old males 16 feet, living dinosaurs. Most people were afraid. Margaret developed scientific curiosity. At 8 years old, she'd observe alligators for hours, taking notes on behaviors. Her father would say, "Gator looks slow, but he's fast as lightning when he strikes. Respect him, but don't fear him. Fear paralyzes. Respect keeps you alive." Margaret absorbed every word, learned to read signs before an attack, distinguish males from females, dangerous from docile. At 15, she saved her brother Tommy from an attack, jumping into the water and facing a 10-foot alligator without hesitation. The story spread. Margaret gained a reputation as someone who understood alligators almost supernaturally. At 18, she worked as a handler in a conservation project. Dangerous work, poorly paid. She spent days handling reptiles that could kill her with one bite, developed techniques that minimized risks. That's where she met David Mitchell, a biologist from Boston researching Everglades alligators. David had theoretical knowledge. Margaret had decades of practical knowledge. He was impressed. "You should go to college for biology. You have natural talent." Margaret laughed. "College is for people with money and time. I have a family to feed." But David persisted. Over the months, they developed friendship, then something deeper. They married 2 years later, had a daughter in 1988, Mary Ruth. David and Margaret formed the perfect team at work. He with science, she with practice. Life was hard but good. Margaret, at 30, was respected as one of the region's greatest experts in alligator behavior. Leave in the comments what city you're watching this video from. In 1995, when Mary Ruth was 7, everything changed. Traffickers discovered that the vastness of the Everglades was the perfect route for cocaine from South America. Small planes, fast boats, violent men transforming ranches into support points. The community where Margaret worked ended up in the middle of one of these routes. Some accepted drug money, desperate from poverty. William, Margaret's father, refused. Dirty money brings disaster. David, as a federal employee, also positioned himself against it, reporting suspicious activities. Brave stance, but dangerous. One June afternoon, 3 men showed up at the research station. They weren't subtle. The biologist should stop making reports. It would be better if he saw nothing, heard nothing, said nothing. David said he would continue doing his duty. Margaret begged him to be careful. "Maggie, if we all stay silent out of fear, these thugs take over everything. Someone has to resist." 2 weeks later, David didn't return from a field trip. Margaret organized a search with local fishermen. They found the boat empty. 3 days later, a fisherman found the body trapped in submerged roots. Signs of torture, shot to the back of the head, clear execution. Police came from Miami. Superficial investigation, registered as unsolved homicide, left. Margaret buried her husband on a day of torrential rain. Mary Ruth, 7 years old, stood silent beside her mother, not fully understanding, only knowing her father would never return. Margaret didn't cry. She was in a cold place where there was only hatred and determination. The same men who had threatened David were at the funeral, watching, ensuring the message was received. In the following months, Margaret tried to keep working, but she wasn't the same anymore. Saw traffickers circulating freely, strutting with absolute impunity. Police did nothing. The conservation project, without
David, and without funding, closed. Margaret was laid off, went back to working as a tour guide, but rage grew inside her like a tumor. It was during a guiding job that Margaret had the epiphany that would change everything. They were observing an enormous alligator, a male 16 feet long, almost 900 pounds. Tourists took photos, while Margaret explained about the bite force, capable of crushing bones like dry twigs. And as she spoke, looking at that primitive and perfect reptile, she thought of David, how armed men had tortured and killed him so easily, thought about how traffickers circulated without fear, protected by weapons and the absence of the state. Then she thought, but would they be afraid of this? Of 900 pounds of muscles and teeth that crush human skulls with one bite? The idea was monstrous, impossible, but once planted, it couldn't be removed. Margaret knew places where large alligators concentrated, where tourists never went because it was too dangerous. Knew behaviors, knew how to attract reptiles, make them associate locations with food. And she had a clear mental list of men who had killed her husband, who operated with impunity, destroying lives while the law looked the other way. For 3 months, Margaret planned meticulously, identified a remote tributary of the Shark River, a place called Death Slough because of the quantity of alligators in its murky waters, started feeding the reptiles regularly, using fish she caught, creating a Pavlovian association. When someone arrived there, there was food. In a few weeks, she had a congregation of 20 adult alligators, some over 10 feet long, that came immediately when they detected human presence. The next step was identifying targets. Margaret spent weeks observing trafficking operations, noting names, faces, routines. The leader was known as Gator, ironically, a 40-year-old man bald with a scar on his face. He had 2 lieutenants, slim, tall and skeletal, and Crow, short and nervous. Below them 10 men, as security, boatmen, pilots. 14 men in total directly involved in the operations that had killed David. Margaret knew she couldn't attack them directly. They were armed, trained, violent. But they had weak points. They were outsiders in the Everglades, didn't know the region like she did, didn't understand natural dangers, trusted their weapons too much, and most importantly, they didn't know alligators, didn't respect those animals as they should. It was the arrogance of those who thought themselves apex predators and didn't realize that in the Everglades, humans were just another potential prey. The first target was Rat, a security guard who fished alone always in the late afternoon, relaxing before his night shift. Margaret observed the pattern for 2 weeks, confirmed it was consistent. Same place, same time, always alone. On the chosen afternoon, she arrived at Death Slough an hour early, threw dead fish in the water, calling alligators that came in large numbers. Waited hidden in the vegetation, heart pounding hard. When Rat arrived in his canoe, tied it to a root, prepared his rod, totally oblivious to danger. He was a few yards from 6 large alligators submerged, only eyes and nostrils visible in the muddy water. Margaret waited until he was focused on fishing, back turned, then threw a large fish directly at his feet in the shallow water. The reaction was instantaneous and brutal. 3 alligators moved simultaneously, but one of them, a 13-foot male, mistook Rat's leg for food. The bite caught his entire calf, force so great it yanked the man off the bank, pulling him into the water. Rat screamed, pure terror echoing through the silent Everglades, trying to grab anything, but he was in total panic, thrashing in the water, attracting more alligators. A second alligator bit his arm, a third his torso. Margaret watched motionless as the alligators performed the death roll, that devastating rotation that dismembers and drowns simultaneously. Rat disappeared beneath the surface in less than 30 seconds. Water stayed agitated and reddened for minutes before returning to apparent calm. When it ended, there was no body, no canoe, no evidence that a human had been there. Satisfied alligators slowly dispersed. Margaret rode silently away, feeling dark satisfaction and horror at what she had done, but stronger than everything, feeling that finally, for the first time since David's death, she had done something. News circulated quickly among traffickers. They thought Rat had run off, but found the canoe destroyed and bloodied downriver. Obvious conclusion? Alligator attack. Idiot fishing where he shouldn't, commented Gator without emotion. Losses were part of the business. They didn't investigate because alligator attacks, though rare, happened in the Everglades. Nobody suspected deliberate orchestration. Who would use alligators as a murder weapon? Concept too absurd. But Margaret knew it had worked
Perfectly, and knew she could repeat it. The second target was Slim, Maine lieutenant. More difficult because more protected, but he had a weakness: women. Spent money on prostitutes, reputation for violence. Margaret spread a rumor of a new girl working in a remote area of the Everglades, discreet location. Described the location of an abandoned ranch yards from an alligator feeding point. The bait worked. Slim arrived armed but confident. There was no prostitute. Before he realized the trap, Margaret emerged from the shadows. He vaguely recognized her, the biologist's widow, but saw no danger. Woman of 110 pounds. He, armed man of almost 220. Margaret didn't respond verbally. Had a long pole with a loop at the end, tool for capturing alligators. Before Slim could draw his weapon, she used the pole with surgical precision, looping his ankle, pulling hard, pushing with her shoulder. He fell off balance. In that second, Margaret was on him, surprisingly strong, trained by years carrying heavy equipment, containing reptiles weighing hundreds of pounds. Used a technique for immobilizing alligators, quick strike with knee to the base of the skull that stunned Slim. Didn't knock him out completely, but disoriented him enough to tie his hands with reinforced nylon rope, same type used for alligator jaws. When he regained consciousness, he was tied, being dragged to the riverbank. "You're crazy! You know who I am? They'll kill you! They'll kill your whole family!" Margaret didn't waste energy responding, just kept dragging, strength fueled by months of accumulated rage. When they reached the water's edge, the alligators were already there, conditioned by feeding time, 8 or 9 large animals, including the 16-foot monster, waiting. Margaret tied Slim to a partially submerged tree, half a yard into the water, position where he was exposed but unable to escape. Alligators approached cautiously, detecting something different. Slim noticed the reptiles, went into total panic, screaming, thrashing. "Please, please, I didn't do anything. Don't leave me here." Margaret finally spoke, voice cold as river water at night. "You killed my husband. You tortured him, executed him like he was nothing. Now you'll understand what it's like to die slowly, with fear, begging for mercy that won't come." Threw dead fish around Slim, covering him with blood and entrails, making him irresistible to conditioned alligators. First alligator bit his leg experimentally, tearing muscle to bone. The scream was inhuman. Margaret turned her back, started walking, but couldn't avoid hearing sounds behind, screams turning to gurgles as water filled his mouth, jaws crushing bones, violent thrashing as multiple alligators fought over the prey.
It took 15 minutes for silence to return. When she looked back, there was nothing but muddy water and satisfied alligators sunbathing. Slim had completely disappeared, consumed by the Everglades itself. This time, the disappearance caused more alarm. Slim was a lieutenant, not someone who simply vanished. Gator ordered extensive searches, interrogated locals, threatened those involved, but nobody knew anything. 2 attacks in 1 month. Maybe alligators were more aggressive. Maybe breeding season. Gator ordered everyone to go armed, in groups, but didn't suspect deliberate human action. Margaret waited a month before the next move. Needed attention to decrease, deal with the psychological weight of what she was doing. Killing Rat had been almost accidental, but Slim was different. Tied him deliberately, condemned him to horrible death, heard his screams, felt no genuine regret because she remembered David's tortured body, but couldn't avoid nightmares where she was being devoured. Mary Ruth noticed her mother wasn't well. "Mom, are you sick?" Margaret hugged her daughter, crushing weight of keeping terrible secrets. "Just tired, honey. It'll pass." 3rd, 4th, 5th targets were mid-level security. Margaret varied methods, learning, adapting. One fell into a snare trap that threw him into water over a congregation of alligators. Another knocked out, woke tied in a drifting canoe directed to rapids where alligators waited. 5th tried to attack Margaret, but she used knowledge of pressure points from immobilizing reptiles. Armed man discovered too late that a 110-pound handler knew exactly where to press to cause incapacitating pain. Ended up in the water like the others. In 6 months, 7 of the 14 men were dead. Trafficker community in panic. Didn't believe in coincidence. Something was wrong. Considered rival faction revenge, disguised police operation, or curse. Gator hired gunmen from New York to investigate, but Margaret was a ghost. Left no witnesses, had no obvious pattern beyond water and alligators. Was so naturally part of that landscape, nobody noticed her. Humble widow who fished and guided tourists. Certainly not a serial killer using reptiles.
Moments of vulnerability during transport. Through contacts with victims' families, the vigilante justice groups got information about when Gator would be transferred from Miami to Atlanta for judicial hearing. Transfer would be by road, common police vehicle, 2 guards. Because budgets are tight, security isn't always priority. Margaret prepared ambush on Alligator Alley, long and isolated highway that crosses the Everglades. Knew every bridge, every stretch where water came close to asphalt. Chose a specific point where a narrow bridge crossed a channel full of alligators. Using technique refined over months, caused accident that seemed natural. Large branches strategically positioned, puncturing police vehicle tire exactly on the bridge. Police got out to check damage, leaving Gator handcuffed inside car for minutes. Was enough. Margaret emerged from shadows, neutralized first officer with stolen pepper spray, second with precise baton strike learned from self-defense videos. Didn't kill them, just temporarily incapacitated. Dragged handcuffed Gator out of car. He recognized her immediately, genuine terror in eyes. "You, the crazy alligator lady. It was you, all along." Margaret didn't confirm or deny, just pulled him to bridge edge. Water below swarmed with alligators. Dozens of them she had fed at that specific point for weeks, conditioning them. "My husband was a good man," she said, voice colder than ever. "He dedicated his life to protecting these animals, this ecosystem. You and your men took him from me, from our daughter, from the world. And for what? Dirty money? Power over others? Ego? Now you're going to become part of the cycle David loves so much. Alligators will feed, grow, have offspring, and you'll be just nutrients in that chain. It's more than you deserve, but it's what there is." Pushed him off the bridge. Handcuffed Gator had no chance. Sank, emerged, trying to swim, but alligators were already converging. Margaret watched only seconds before turning, running back to forest, leaving stunned officers to wake to a scene of horror and confusion.
The investigation concluded the dangerous prisoner had taken advantage of the accident to attempt escape, fallen in water, been killed by alligators. Explanation that conveniently closed the case without admitting the prison system had failures or that vigilante was operating. Margaret simply disappeared into the immensity of the Everglades, returning to life as handler and guide, nobody suspecting that thin, quiet woman had orchestrated 14 deaths over 2 years. Over time, trafficking operations in that region decreased drastically. Mysterious deaths, combined with FBI operation, broke the infrastructure. Other routes were chosen far from treacherous waters where alligators seemed to have developed inexplicable taste for human flesh. Margaret was never investigated, never connected to crimes. Was just a widow who had lost husband to trafficking violence, lived modestly, raising daughter, working with conservation. Mary Ruth grew up to become a biologist like father, specializing in reptiles like mother, continuing work protecting the Everglades. Never knew what mother had done, how far she had gone to avenge father and protect the region they loved. Margaret aged working with alligators she once turned into weapons, kept feeding them, studying them, protecting them from hunters and developers. Some days she looked at those ancient reptiles and saw not just animals, but silent accomplices in justice that official system never delivered. Other days saw them only as they were, perfect predators doing what evolution programmed them to do, indifferent to human morals, existing beyond good and evil, just surviving. And she, who knew them better than anyone, who had used that knowledge for the darkest of purposes, wondered if that difference really mattered in the end. Would David have approved? Probably not. He believed in law, in process, in institutional justice. But David was dead, and the men who killed him would have continued killing others without consequences if she hadn't acted. This story hits deep because it shows how far a mother and widow can go when the system completely fails and criminals destroy families with absolute impunity in the remote Everglades where state law rarely reaches. Margaret used decades of knowledge about alligators, transforming scientific expertise into a method of justice nobody ever imagined possible. Leave in the comments, do you think she delivered justice or became as monstrous as the criminals she killed? Is it possible to use nature as a weapon without disrespecting the very animals she claimed to protect? If this story impacted you, if it made you think about the boundaries between revenge and justice, subscribe now. Every subscription helps us keep bringing stories of ordinary Americans forced into extraordinary situations. Turn on notifications to not miss upcoming stories from the most remote corners of America where justice has many faces.
Some of them with sharp teeth and bite force of over 2,000 pounds.